All right, are we ready to go? Three, are we ready? Can't hear you if you're talking. Here, I'm going to kill my video. Hopefully that improves my situation here for a second. All right, are we live, Sri? Hello?
Yes, we are live.
All right, very good. All right, so I'm going to call the September 29th Planning and Programming Committee meeting to order. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Let me do a roll call. Mayor Rochelle.
Oops. Here.
All right. Councilmember Schneider.
Here.
Great. Chair Wheeler.
Here.
Mayor Meyer. And we are missing Mayor Meyer. All right. And we have some other MVTA members here as well. I see Mary Hines. Hello. How are you? Do we have anyone else from the MVTA? No, it does not appear we do. Okay, let me just remind everyone, as a result of COVID-19 and the Governor Northam's declaration of a state of emergency, the authority's Planning and Program Committee meeting is being held electronically. With the recent passage of the amendments to House Bill 29, the FOIA bill, which allows regional bodies such as the authority and their committees to conduct business meetings electronically, this evening's business meeting is being held. So will enable us to keep safety as a top priority while ensuring that we're adhering to the social distancing requirements. Meeting by electronic means is authorized because the items on the agenda today are statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of the authority. So at this point, we need to approve the resolution that would allow us to conduct the meeting electronically. Is there a motion to approve that resolution?
So moved.
There's been a motion by Mayor Rochelle, seconded by Chair Wheeler to approve the resolution, which allows electronic meeting. Any further discussion of that resolution? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. That now brings us to the meeting notes from the June 19th meeting. Those meeting notes have been circulated. Are there any edits, modifications, suggestions on the meeting notes? If not, is there a motion to approve the June 19th meeting notes?
So moved.
Motion by Chair Wheeler, seconded by Mayor Rochelle to approve the meeting notes from the June 19th meeting. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, saying nay. The ayes have it. The meeting notes are approved. All right. At this point, we will go now to the transaction update, and I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jasper. You're up.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. Members of the committee, good evening. I hope you can hear me okay. Let me just check that first. Okay, thank you. I have a couple of presentations I want to make this evening, both of which are transaction related. Actually, Shri, can you load the other one first? Okay. Both are transaction related. As you probably recall, we are in the process of ramping up the next update to transaction. This is done on a 5-year cycle. The last or the current version of transaction was adopted by the authority in October of 2017. A couple of things I want to go over with you. starting with an update to the COVID-19 presentation we made to the authority in July. I'm not going to go through any of that presentation again, although I do have some of the slides in this slide deck, but I wanted to give you an update on where our trend monitoring is at the moment, and what we're inferring from that trend monitoring, how that relates to the transaction update. So Shri, if you could go to the next slide. So I'm going to be covering an update on travel trends, discussing some recent survey results, try and explain what we're learning about our scenarios that we used. We used 4 scenarios in our work, and what we're learning for the next transaction updates. The first few slides are from the CTB. Ms. Hines, you will no doubt recognize some of these, but they do provide a good update from VDOT on volume trends in particular. So this first slide is showing the time period. It's a bit hard to read along the horizontal axis, but it's showing the time period from June to through August 20th. It's a statewide summary that was presented to the CTB meeting earlier in September. And what it's showing is the percentage change from last year, so a 2020 versus 2019 comparison. The blue line is showing the trend in for all vehicles, the change from this year, from last year to this year, and the orange line is showing specifically showing trucks, and that orange line is generally showing that truck traffic is pretty much back to pre-COVID levels across the state as a whole. The blue line is generally within 15% of the pre-COVID levels. Next slide, please. So this slide really just picks up the time period from just before Independence Day through to the most recent data that was available, and here you can just see a little bit more clearly how the truck traffic in orange and the all vehicle traffic in blue are kind of stabilizing around 0% variation and around minus 15% variation across the Commonwealth as a whole. Next slide, please. This slide also is kind of looking at a slightly more recent period from July through August. And you see 4 lines, and again, they're showing percent change from last year. The top block of 2 lines, the orange and the blue lines here, are showing interstates, with the orange line representing PM peak and the blue line representing AM peak for all vehicles. And then the lower block, another 2 lines are for non-interstates, with the maroon line showing PM peak and the green line showing the AM peak. And what you're seeing here is that the PM peak in both cases, the orange line and the maroon lines are slightly closer to being back to normal than the AM peak. This perhaps is relatively easily explained by virtue of the fact that the AM peak is probably predominantly commuting traffic, whereas the afternoon peak is a combination of commuting and other journey purposes, which may still be happening, whereas commuting is obviously quite affected. But if you look at the lower 2 lines for the non-interstates, you can see more clearly a weekly cycle, and it's interesting to note just how the peak of the curve for both the maroon and green is the weekend. And obviously the bits in between are weekdays. So it's interesting that weekend travel is getting back to normal faster, or at least appears to be more closely back to normal than weekdays are at the moment. So we found that was interesting. Next slide, please. So also covering the period from June through to August 20th. What we're showing here is the volume change year to year for each of the VDOT districts. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the yellow line, which is generally speaking the lowest of the districts that are shown here, is Northern Virginia. And so you can see among the different districts within the Commonwealth, Northern Virginia is the furthest away from being back to pre-pandemic levels. And if you recall, I think the statewide average is about 15% below, and Northern Virginia is showing about 20% below pre-pandemic levels. Next slide, please. So here we're just looking at a couple of specific facilities. The top one is I-66 eastbound inside the Beltway, and the lower block is the inner loop of the Beltway from the Mixing Bowl to the Braddock Road interchange. And so what you're seeing here is in terms of the lower block, the inner loop, recovery is getting pretty close, still maybe 10% off, but there is still quite a large variation as far as 66 inside the Beltway is concerned, although recovery is clearly happening. We don't know the specific reasons for why two roads that are relatively close to each other geographically are showing such different patterns, but we hypothesized that 66 inside the Beltway, which is the upper block, is perhaps has got more DC-centric travel patterns than does the inner loop of the Beltway, which probably is more heavily influenced by the Tysons area, and so this may kind of indicate that the recovery is taking a lot longer for travel patterns to the district, whereas suburb to suburb may actually be at a more advanced stage of recovery.
I would it's Mary, I'd just add that the presence of the tolls probably has more to do with 66 inside the Beltway than not that people are taking alternative routes because they're not as crowded. They're avoiding the tolls. That's, I think, part of the picture there too.
True, yeah, and I think that's probably related. Yeah. Thank you. Slide 7, please, Sharif. So just one look at congestion trends. What you see here, ignore the key off to the left-hand side, but the left-hand maps are showing the AM peak hour and the PM peak hour for September of 2019, and the two right-hand blocks are showing the corresponding time period for 2020, and color-coded according to speed. And I think what you see quite clearly is there's more red, orange, and yellow in the two graphics on the left-hand side compared to their equivalents for this year in the pandemic environment. So even though volumes are approaching recovery, travel speeds here are still quite noticeably different. And just kind of referring back to the previous slide, if you look at 66 inside the Beltway in September of 2019, that's quite a rainbow of colours you can see there. In September of 2020, it's all green. Similarly, if you look at the inner loop of the Beltway, just to the west of I-95, you can see that both of those are in the AM peak. Both of those are looking different. In the AM peak 2019, you can see quite a lot of red from the Springfield interchange going off towards 66, and on the right in the AM peak for September 2020, you can see it is all green. So speeds certainly are still looking pretty good. Next slide, please. MTA staff has done a quick analysis using a regional tool referred to as Ridership, which contains a lot of information from about traffic behaviours in the region. We kind of wanted to kind of numerically see what was happening. So looking at the AM peak period and the PM peak period for both September of 2019 and September of 2020, you can see that 2020 is still showing, on average across the region as a whole, between around 10 and 13% increase in average speed. So this is an average across the entire region. So those numbers may not sound very impressive, and that may not sound like a big difference. But when you add it up across the whole region, that's actually quite a significant difference. Next slide, please. So turning to transit, this graphic, which is in the Commission's meeting packet for their upcoming October 1st meeting, shows the monthly ridership or boardings in Northern Virginia for Metro Rail in green, for buses including Metro Bus in blue, and then for VRE in purple. And you can quite clearly see the pandemic's impact from March of this year, but in the last few months, you do see a gentle slope upwards for Metro Rail and Bus. VRE, unfortunately, here is still flatlining. NBTC does have data for July and August and September, and that information does indicate that uptick is continuing, but still a pretty bleak picture, and also interesting that if you look at see Metro Rail dominates under normal conditions, but under pandemic conditions, Metro Rail is actually lower than Bus now in the region in terms of Northern Virginia transit boardings. And again, it kind of raises questions about DC-centric travel behaviour. The separate research that has been shared with us indicates that rail riders in particular have more choice of travel options, and that may mean that they're still travelling, but not necessarily by rail modes. Bus has gone down, but perhaps in percentage terms it hasn't gone down anywhere near as much as the rail modes have. And obviously, rail, both Metro Rail and VRE are both very DC-centric travel behaviours for the most part. So that obviously is also a factor here as well. Next slide, please. This is information from Metro, from WMATA. It was presented to a Finance and Capital Committee meeting earlier in the month, and it basically looks at the same sort of information, just focusing on Metro Rail and Metro Bus from the beginning of the pandemic until well into August. So again, following the same sort of pattern, complete tanking of demand in March, and an ever so gentle recovery in in Metro Bus, in fact, more than in Metro Rail. And again, you can see here how Metro Rail and Metro Bus have flipped in terms of which is carrying the most riders. The next slide, please. This is also from the same WMATA Finance Committee meeting. So the left-hand side is showing actual ridership on a quarterly basis. You see a vertical line indicating the onset of the COVID-19 impact. And then to the right of actual, you see what's referred to as scenario, and that's looking out over the quarters to fourth quarter of fiscal year 21. And there are two lines. The upper line, the light grey line, is the ridership forecast from when Metro originally approved their fiscal 21 budget, and the dotted red line is the subsequent update to the fiscal 21 budget, and what's referred to as the likely scenario. And obviously, this is a pretty grim read. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. And that the likely scenario is looking at a fiscal year 21 quarter four ridership of 20.5 million versus the 73 million that was originally projected, which compares to the 82 million which is the summary of actual ridership for fiscal year 19 quarter four. So some real tough challenges there for WMATA going forward. Next slide, please. So now I want to turn to a couple of quick summaries of some recent surveys. This first one is from Commuter Connections. This is a survey that was conducted in May and June. 180 employers responded to this survey, and at the time of the survey, 95% of the work sites had telework, which is a pretty high number. But even before the pandemic, 76% of work sites had some telework before. But during the pandemic, the average share of employees has absolutely skyrocketed from 36% to 82% at the sites with telework. And just kind of skimming through some of this information, 80% of employers have managers reported the benefits of managing remotely, and 92% of employers said their employees reported the benefits of working from home as not commuting, a comfortable work environment, and personal cost savings. I do question now, given that the survey was conducted in May and June, as to whether, if the survey were to be repeated, whether there might be additional reactions from the employees about feelings of isolation and needing kind of a greater degree of work-related socialization. But more of that will no doubt come later. The next slide, please. So this second survey was conducted in June and July by VDOT and DRPT, and this was a survey of commuters, almost 5,500 respondents. This is statewide. 3 times as many commuters are working from home at least once a week compared to pre-COVID. Of those 76% are working full-time compared to only 13% working full-time previously. And interestingly, 60% of these employees did not know when they would be returning to their workplace. But 80% of respondents would like to work from home at least one day per week when the pandemic is over. Next slide, please. This is the most recent survey from the Greater Washington Partnership. This was conducted in August. and includes 430 employers representing over 250,000 residents. And I will say that the Greater Washington Partnership geographic footprint includes not just the Greater Washington area, but also Baltimore and Richmond. So you have to take that into account as you kind of absorb this information. The employers indicated that this fall, about a third of their workforce was expected to physically return to work sites. Of those employers who had long-term reopening plans, they expect to have 72% of their employees back by next summer. But a third of the responding employers still are unsure of what their return to work plans will be by next summer. Interestingly, and perhaps concerning to quite a large extent, half of the employers responding indicated a high level of concern with public transit safety and expressed a low level of confidence that public agencies can control crowding and enforce the wearing of masks on transit vehicles. And I would say to kind of attempt to mitigate this, when these survey results were published, the Greater Washington Partnership also published a transit tracker, a real-time tracker, which could help potential riders to understand crowding levels at stations and on trains to help people decide maybe that things weren't as bad as they were perceiving without actually having to go to a station to kind of find that out. So that's a tool which may prove useful and a useful model for other regions going forward. And recently, actually in the last day, I think, Greater Washington Partnership has provided an additional piece of analysis regarding those employers who do have a plan for next August. And they've indicated that more than 20% of their workforce could be teleworking full time, which, if true, would represent a 15 percentage point increase compared to current levels. So that was quite a significant new piece of information and quite relevant to the scenario analysis that we had conducted. So Sri, if you can go to the next slide. I just want to now revisit what this all means for our scenario definitions. And as a quick reminder, we looked at 4 scenarios: quick recovery and a cautious recovery were kind of bookends on the scenario library shelf, as it were, and in between there was an active transportation where there were some assumptions made about a much higher level of walk and bike activity for shorter trips, and the ominous second pandemic wave in October. We looked at 2 time periods in the short term, this year and next, and then what we call the new normal, which is looking out to 2025, which in long-range transportation planning terms is actually pretty near term. But it was a year for which we had some analytical tools available to us, and so we chose to settle on 2025 for this part of the analysis. The next slide, please. So for each scenario, for each time frame, we came up with a set of assumptions, and you kind of have to flip your reading of the table here, because now the scenarios are the columns rather than the rows. And for each scenario, we made assumptions about telework, jobs lost, school attendance, transit safety perception, active transportation, quite a few other things as well, but these were the main ones. And you can see what kind of percentage changes were assumed. These are not predictions, these were assumptions, so that we could look at the impact of each of these 4 scenarios, both in the short term and in the new normal conditions. Next slide, please. One variable that was also part of the assumptions set, which wasn't reported to the authority previously, was the assumption on vaccine availability and vaccination program, which I guess back at the time we did this work was maybe too far out for many people to kind of really be taking too seriously or too urgently at that time back in early summer. Now, things are perhaps moving a little bit closer to a vaccine. Certainly, there's a lot of activity going on around the world as far as developing vaccines. But the assumptions that we made originally were that for 3 of the 4 scenarios, a vaccine would be available by January of 2021. Under the cautious recovery, the assumption was February of 2021 for a vaccine to be available. And then we looked at made some assumptions about the rate of vaccination, and our work assumed an 80% vaccination rate by June of 2021 for the first 3 scenarios, and a couple of months later for the cautious recovery. And I'll say as an aside, we've seen, we've had briefings on other things from other organizations that we've not posted or shared, but there's a company that we're following closely who have a tracking survey of over 1,000 US citizens across the nation, and they've asked about people's attitudes towards vaccination. And it's quite interesting that 20% of people, roughly, that's a ballpark number. The exact number is probably slightly different, but ballpark, about 20% of the respondents are saying they're going to get vaccinated as soon as they possibly can. About 20% of people said, you can't pay me enough money to ever get vaccinated. I'm not going to take a vaccination. And 60% of the people have said, I'm going to take the vaccination, but I'm in no tearing hurry to take the vaccination. I'd like to see what happens to the first wave of people who get vaccinated before I decide when I'm going to get vaccinated. So the fact that we assumed 80% vaccination by the middle of next year is probably somewhat consistent, although at the time that assumption was made, we did not have the advantage of that newer research. Next slide, please. So just very quickly look at the short-term impacts. Next slide. So looking at vehicle miles travelled, this is the performance of daily vehicle miles of travel for each of the 4 scenarios from the beginning of 2020 through the end of calendar year 2021, and you can see each scenario is kind of unfolding in different ways at different times. But note there's a red bar I've added now in between August and September of 2020. This bar indicates primarily based on the VDOT information, which is showing recovery of traffic volumes, and volumes and VMT are not exactly the same thing, although they probably trend in a similar way. And what this is showing is that our quick recovery scenario and active transportation scenarios are both within the likely range based on that information from the VDOT. And in addition, the second wave is also in that likely range, although I would caution, if you kind of look to the purple line, which is the second wave, there is a precipitous drop in daily vehicle miles of travel, which is about to hit if that scenario actually comes to be. So, certainly 3 of the 4 scenarios for now, at least, are looking in the right sort of ballpark based on current observations. The cautious recovery is looking really too cautious at this time. So that we thought was useful to kind of see how these scenarios are trending. Next slide, please. So this is looking at impacts on vehicle speed. This is kind of slightly harder for us to kind of get a read on with the information we have available to us at the moment. But by and large, it looks like quick recovery and active transportation are pretty much tracking with the vehicle speed information that we have, and the speeds associated with second wave and cautious recovery are just a little bit too high. But but like I say, we should be cautious with the interpretation of this because the data is just a little bit too kind of fragile at the moment to be too definitive in what it's telling us. Next slide, please. So this is looking at person hours of delay. We don't have a current read on person hours of delay. It's easy for our models to produce these numbers. It's harder to actually get an observation on delay, particularly an observation across the entire region. We are looking at the Ridership data. There are ways we think we can get a proxy to this, but we're not there yet. So I can't really give a strong opinion on where we are tracking, but I would say that probably, again, the quick recovery and active transportation slopes for August, September are probably more likely to be in the ballpark than the second wave and the cautious recovery. And in fact, if you look at the purple and the blue lines, you see that towards the beginning of October, those two lines intersect around 0 person hours of delay. And I don't think at the current time that's entirely likely to be reflective of where we are at the moment. But obviously, to give the second wave its full title, second wave of the pandemic in October, we're still a couple of days away from that. And so, I mean, hopefully that won't happen, but it's a bit early to be able to weigh in on whether that's realistic or not. Next slide, please. So I just want to, now to look at what the scenario said about transit ridership and what the data is telling us. And you can see the red bar. And unlike the previous scenarios, the transit ridership is just not tracking with any of our scenarios. And initially, we thought this was an outlier, but as we look at the MBTC and the WMATA information, not only does this look to be realistic, the WMATA predictions don't give us any comfort that red bar is going to be any different by the middle of next year in terms of its level. And so this is something which I would say is concerning. I don't want to create a panic at this time. It still needs to be monitored as things play out. But it is something that we need to be very mindful of. Is that while the scenarios, some of the scenarios are tracking reasonably well with observations on the highway side, on the transit ridership side, they are not. Next slide, please. So just actually go to the next slide. This is actually my final slide. I'm not really going to talk about this very much other than just to highlight the quick recovery, which is kind of like our maybe the left-hand bookend of the scenarios versus the cautious recovery, which is the right-hand bookend. The down arrows indicate the biggest change for each measure. And it doesn't seem at the moment that the cautious scenario, which shows a lot of the biggest changes, is really in play. I think, if anything, the quick recovery, for the most part, is in play, with that caveat that it isn't in play for transit. But certainly the quick recovery is showing 16% reduction in auto trips, 15% reduction in transit trips. And then when you look further down, hours of delay, reduction of 31%. Hours of travel, reduction of 31%. Hours of delay, 57%. Just leave this slide up. I just want to end by saying, that there are three questions that have kind of come to mind, our minds at least, of what all this information is showing us. Firstly, why are traffic volumes trending with the quick recovery and active scenarios, but not transit in the short term? We have a couple of thoughts on this, that the transit safety perceptions that I mentioned earlier are having a bigger impact than was expected. The DC-centric nature of trip making, particularly among rail users, might be hurting ridership more than we thought, certainly compared to suburb travel, and rail travellers shifting to auto use potentially is something we hadn't, I think, really taken into account as a strong possibility. Second question is, what does this mean for the region in the short term, particularly looking at congestion and transit ridership? Certainly there is a need. I think moves are underway for transit, for promotional campaigns by the transit agencies to really address the safety perception issue. But at the same time, we are looking at a fiscal cliff potentially of issues that are providing a real headwind for transit at the moment. How close are we to a return to normal congestion? That's a big question. We don't know necessarily that even when we get back to pre-pandemic traffic volumes, that congestion will necessarily return as it was previously. There's a number of reasons for that, but that would require me to go into some details on the principles of traffic engineering, which I'll spare you from at the moment. And the final question for us right now is, what does all this mean for the region in the medium term, and specifically our approach to transaction? And here, one of the big things is, how robust are the region's assumptions on travel demand patterns with the emergence of higher levels of work from home and higher levels of e-commerce, which I haven't really touched on, but again, that's a big factor in our scenarios. So that's something we need to get our minds around. The modal choice aspects and the longevity of transit service as we know it today is something which we hope it will return to how it was before. But I think we're finding ourselves facing the question, if people stay away from transit and people start working from home, to what extent will things return to normal? Particularly if employers choose different working patterns. And I guess if I can draw any silver lining for you from this at the moment, is that the pandemic is providing spare capacity, or making spare capacity available on the transportation system for the projected growth in population and employment across the region. 24% increase in population, 37% increase in employment through 2040 is something which is mind-boggling to think how the transportation system will accommodate that. So, like I say, if there's a silver lining, the pandemic is perhaps, or the way everyone is reacting to the pandemic is creating opportunities for more capacity on the system. And with that, I'll pause and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jasper, for that terribly sobering presentation. That was certainly not unexpected, but quite stunning to look at. And I think there's a very interesting socioeconomic story that's also being told in this data that I think certainly has to inform our local decision making as we go forward. I would also be interested. I thought the divergence in within transit between the bus and the metro rail certainly is an interesting story, and I'd be curious as we look at our local bus systems as well, whether we're seeing some of that same trend line. I know I served on our local bus system board for many years, and a lot of our ridership was a derivative of what we saw in metro rail for a long time. Given that we fed into that, and I'd be curious if that trend is continuing now. It's going to be a treacherous place for policymakers for a while. All right, other questions for Mr. Jasper on the data? Mayor Rochelle.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. That was an excellent, very information-packed presentation. Thank you, Keith. I have two quick questions. May we have the electronic copy of this for our records so that we can look it over and digest it a little bit better? And second, we were made aware some months ago that truck traffic had dropped off by 80%, and you said it's now sort of bounced back. Do we have the percentage now by which it is depressed?
Yes, Mayor Rochelle, based on the most recent presentation to CTB, it looks like across the Commonwealth as a whole, it is back to normal, back to pre-pandemic levels. Whether there are any regional variations, perhaps Ms. Hines may actually have more insight on that than I do.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Keith. I must admit it was almost a month ago we had our presentation, so I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that data is available by major interstate corridors, so it's certainly gettable, I think.
Thank you. Well, we were certainly drilled down into that. We were conscious that we could completely overwhelm you with data and visualizations tonight, and so we started at a fairly high level, but in this presentation, but our own analysis has kind of peeled back several layers of the onion. So we're certainly taking action to kind of drill down into where we are with truck traffic at the regional and corridor level, if that data is available to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions for Mr. Jasper?
Yeah, Dave Snyder.
Snyder.
Let me just throw a bunch of questions on the table. I think now we need to include remote, I almost said remote learning, but I mean work from home as a major transportation modality. And then begin to understand, and by the way, ever since Jerry Connolly made that a cog, the growth has been slow and not very, sometimes not steady, but generally on the rise. Well, one thing the pandemic did was it changed all that. And from what I understand, a lot of employers are not going to come back to in-office for a long time, and a lot are never going to get back to where they were before. So we need to understand the teleworking environment much better and understand it now as a major transportation modality. The second thing is the highways. Trying to put it all together, it seems to me like if you preferred to drive before, you're still driving. If you used to take transit and you have to go to work physically, you now drive generally. And so with all the data, I'm still trying to figure out what we do as responsible policymakers. And then, and it goes to your scenarios, do we ever get back to where we were before? And I'm tending to think not in a lot of ways. And yet you have to, if the best thing happens and there's a vaccine and it gets out to people. The other thing I would say is I would not necessarily peg the recovery totally on the vaccine metric. I think another metric is to whether the medical community is capable of treating people that get this stuff and preventing them from dying. I'm putting that pretty crassly, but there may be a series of things. There may not be single reliance on the vaccination. Maybe a factor. Vaccination may be a factor. A, is it effective, and B, widely distributed and used. But the medical community's ability to treat people once they get infected to prevent them from becoming serious or fatalities, is all something we ought to grind in there. But the big thing that hits me more than anything is the extent to which people are working from home. I don't think a lot of that's going to change. And what does that say to transit? And my concern is we draw the wrong lessons in terms of the highway use, because from this presentation, and it may actually be the right conclusion, but from this presentation, it seems to me that it's the highway infrastructure and we ought to have more of it because that's the way people are deciding they want to go. Finally, on trucks, many of us, I suspect not just me, are on this daily feed from the region as to what's happening on the highways. It's less so in Virginia, but is true in Maryland, particularly the curve over the Beltway. You're having major truck crashes almost every night. And there was a fatal one in Fairfax County recently. So I think there's a truck safety issue, which we need to think about as in terms of transportation planners. So I'm just throwing out sort of a bunch of different reactions, and I'd invite others to violently disagree and, whatever, but this is really an understatement. This is really difficult and dramatic stuff.
Thank you, Councilmember Schneider. Other questions, comments?
Justin, could I put a couple on the table? It's Mary.
Yeah, yes, Ms. Hines, you're up.
So I'm reminded almost every day that one of the facts of life of the fall, which is that school starts up, hasn't happened yet. And I think we need to keep our eye on that. As people are more nervous about being out in the air, I think we're going to see, trouble around schools that we wouldn't have seen in the past. What are schools doing about putting kids on buses or not? All of that has the potential to give us, I guess, more food for thought. I'm with Dave. I don't know what the right thing to do is around transit policy. I would say right now, I think there's a whole bunch of things roads that we're building in the Commonwealth that we probably aren't going to need for another 5 years or so. And so what's the smartest thing to do, even though that money is there right now? And at the same time, people are so nervous about being around others that it's very hard to figure out what the right solution is on transit. The data that you have, and I appreciate Keith, your comments that, we're really commuter centric in terms of both Metro Rail and VRE, but there is activity going on in the local systems that is more of the connecting communities kind of stuff. And I wonder if there's any way for us to get a handle on whether, on what the trend lines are there. Are people using transit to shop? My grocery stores, while they're busier on the weekends, you can't really tell too much, any peaks on grocery shopping anymore. People just kind of go whenever. So are there things we can learn about transit use during the day in a situation where people are basically home and their schedules have more flexibility in them? So those are my couple of questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hines. Let me just tack on to kind of weave together something that Ms. Hines and Mr. Schneider both said, and I feel like there's a common thread here on the transit side. So, clearly we're not going to change Metro. We're not going to reroute Metro Rail on the fly, right? But we do have on Metro Bus, as well as all of our local bus systems, we have infrastructure that is in place today that is designed around a commuting pattern that is just simply not going to be the case for at least the short term. And I think Mary's absolutely right. I think we should have the conversation, particularly with the local systems where we're much more flexible. We should have the conversations about how we look at reallocation of infrastructure and resources to serve the transportation trips that still are occurring and that will be occurring. And in some ways, this is just we're pressing fast forward on a trend that was already going on anyway. I mean, we have in Alexandria, I cite this often, we have a building that went up on Eisenhower Avenue a couple of years ago across from the National Science Foundation. Sorry, Mary. That has over 500 apartments in it. And a third of those, this is pre-COVID, a third of the folks in that building work out of their apartment. That was pre-COVID. And, you know, so we've now basically put fast forward on that trend that was already happening. And suddenly our traffic patterns have changed dramatically. And so you have folks who are not going to be maybe commuting in the district, but they're still going to be making trips all over this region. And I think to the extent we have transit infrastructure that is can be modified on the fly, or at least relatively on the fly, I think those are things we probably should look at, because we have the infrastructure, we've already invested in it, and we're continuing to fund the operational cost. And so I think we might have an opportunity to better serve the community, particularly in this time where the use case that all this infrastructure was put in place for is not in existence right now. So I think it's worthy of a conversation. Chair Wheeler.
So I'll just be the devil's advocate and just sort of say the other, you know, I remember when all this started and some of the projections that were put in front of us or me, you know, of things that might happen and expectations. And I guess what I would say is that we don't really know what's going to happen, and we wouldn't want to make any knee-jerk reactions just based on what we think might happen until, you know, so many of the things that we have to do are long range anyway. And I think that we've seen that. I'm surprised that vehicular traffic has bounced back as much as it has until people talked about the fact that the used car market was exploding because people didn't want to take mass transit. And so I don't know what's going to happen to Metro and VRE and the buses less so, but you know, it seems like there has been a switch. And I guess I would just sort of say I would caution in that we don't really know what's going to happen. I think we're in uncharted waters. And so the ability to remain nimble and pivot and, you know, make choices is important. But that doesn't mean we just put things on hold, because even with the roads that, at least I know the roads that we were building around us, they were still overcrowded, even with, you know, with some of the growth that's coming in the region. And so the question is, you know, would those roads, they might actually be better off and functioning better now that they have less traffic on them. It seems like we sort of accept a level of degradation as normal anyway. And maybe it would be nice if normal was green. You know, I've sort of looked at these maps sometimes and we sort of accept that normal isn't necessarily green in a cost benefit analysis. And I would just say that we don't really know what's going to happen, because I certainly know at the beginning of this, there were things that people said were going to happen and haven't. And so I'm just sort of waiting to see, you know, I would just caution us to wait to see before we made any decisions to change, is all I would say.
Mayor Meyer.
Following up on Ann's comment, from the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's perspective, we have over $1 billion in the pipeline, 1.3, is it, Monica? Something in that neighborhood. And our projects, this is kind of stating the obvious, really take 3 to 5 years or even longer from application to scoring to approval to engineering to letting a contract to negotiating with in all the back and forth with VDOT to a ribbon cutting is anywhere from 5 to 7 years, maybe 8 years even. It depends. And we've been at this pandemic now for 7 months, 8 months at the most. And from a policy perspective, and I am a strong advocate for multimodal transportation systems. Please don't misunderstand at all. But I think that from a transportation policy perspective, and given the charter of the NVTA, the legislation, our raison d'etre, we are primarily making improvements to as-built infrastructure across the region, and with some exceptions. And I don't think that at this point, I think all of the discussion that has ensued in the last few minutes are good points. And I appreciate Dave Snyder making the initial comment that spurred this, but I think it's premature for us to believe that there's going to be a fundamental, permanent, long-term shift in transportation needs for the region. There will be some, yes, but our as-built infrastructure is really going to drive a lot of this. And I would like to think that in some ways I'm proven wrong, but at this point, I don't believe that there's any kind of seismic and permanent change in direction with respect to transportation long term. I don't say that in an affirmation way. I don't say it as a negative. I simply, it's kind of an acknowledgement of our reality. And so that's kind of where I am at this point. So anyway, thank you, Chair Wilson, for letting me speak.
Absolutely, thank you, Mayor Meyer. Any other comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I
Mayor
agree
Rochelle.
with, yeah, thank you. I agree with Mayor Meyer. I'm very optimistic about the future. I do believe people will continue to want personal vehicles. It's a form of personal freedom, no matter what power source those vehicles might run off of. I think people will always want their own vehicles. And maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think life will go back to normal eventually. Life went back to normal after the 1918 influenza pandemic. It even went back to normal after the plague swept through Europe. So probably took longer, but I do think humans have short memories. And I think that this will be in the past before we know it, and life will be back to normal. So we're going to need infrastructure. Thank you.
Oops, sorry. Okay, thank you, Mayor Rochelle. Any further comments? I mean, the good news on the data, it shows that we have massively decreased congestion, massively decreased delay. So that bodes very well for Ms. Backman's performance appraisal this year. So, well done. All right. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Backman for the NVTA update.
Thank you, Chair Wilson, and I appreciate it. And this is a great segue because Governance and Personnel Committee meets next Thursday at 5:30 p.m. We are working on the packet. The big item for that agenda, of course, is what's going on with the General Assembly session. But Tracy Baynard and myself, we will discuss something that we're noticing, and we want to try to make sure that this doesn't become a trend when we have citizens that are upset in regards to the direction that a project is going, or decisions that are made on projects at the local level. What we're seeing is, and it's not just Prince William, Chair Wheeler. I did want to note that.
I was going to say, which jurisdiction could that be? Gosh.
They're instead of really working out the issues with the locality, the authority, we are being brought into it to the point where people are discussing additional legislation, and in one case, just the non-existence of the authority. So we will have that level of conversation, and just to make sure we do our part on the authority's end to just better inform or continue to inform people what we can and cannot do. We do not implement. You know, we do fund the projects, we do follow the projects. We have the Nova Gateway that was unveiled to the region and to the members a few weeks ago, but we will have that level of discussion because sometimes additional legislation creates problems that were unanticipated. So I did want to note that. And then, of course, we have the authority meeting that will follow the Governance and Personnel Committee meeting. For the most part, the agenda is pretty light, but I say light loosely because sometimes I think it's something light and you guys may disagree, but we do have a fairly light agenda. I will be sending out some additional materials in regards to the Traction Power Upgrades project. And that is essentially all that I have. We had a presentation schedule or tentatively scheduled in regards to VTrans update times, but we are going to push that back to the November meeting, so the authority can be briefed from the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment on the proposed changes that are underway with the VTrans.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Backman, and to Chair Wheeler. If it comes to a choice between the existence of the authority and kicking you guys out, I'm just saying you guys are on your own. So
I'm like, how quickly can we bring down the MBTA?
Yeah, I'm just saying if we gotta pick safety and numbers here. So,
I know, it's okay. I understand.
Any questions for Ms. Backman? And then if not, I think Mr. Jasper had another update you wanted to add. Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Jasper.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Wilson. Just very quickly, I want to introduce the topic of transaction vision and goals. Just as a brief information item tonight, we do have a short presentation. Again, we didn't share with you in advance because it isn't really sufficiently self-explanatory to be fair to do that. So I just want to introduce the topic, and it's one that we will revisit in the future. But if Shri, if you could just quickly put that presentation up. The transaction is driven by vision goals, which in turn feed objectives, measures, and the measures have weightings associated with them. This is kind of what we refer to as performance-based planning, so that we kind of measure the impact of different things. You can go to the next slide. And so each cycle of transaction. We use vision and goals. Typically, over the years, the vision and goals have not really changed very much. But we do feel it's worth just very quickly revisiting the vision and goals, and not just assume that because they worked last time that they're the best vision and goals this time. And I'd also say that the vision and goals ultimately are the authority's vision and goals, and we'll be looking to bring a proposal to the full authority probably in the December timeframe. There's a couple of brief definitions here, but really the two that matter are vision and goals. So, really the vision statement is kind of like idealized, preferred, state, and the goals, give it a little bit more detail, priorities and outcomes. So, it's all generally speaking aspirational. Shri, if you go to the next slide. The current vision and goals are shown on this slide here. I'm not going to dwell on it, but you do see the vision statement to the left. The first part of the vision statement is really the true visionary statement. The second part of that vision statement is perhaps a little bit more explanatory in nature, but not necessarily visionary. And then you can see we have 3 goals and then a bunch of objectives, measures, and each measure has a weight. And in total, there are 15 measures that we used in the previous iteration of transaction, like the current version of transaction. Next slide. I think, yeah, there we go. So we're proposing a slight variation to the vision statement, as stated here. We've been through a number of cycles of discussion with jurisdictional agency staff earlier in this year, so this should be no surprise to any of the folks who work for you, because pretty much all of them had an involvement in kind of crafting this proposed revised vision statement. And again, we're not looking for any discussion, and not certainly not any decision on this evening, but looking to clean it up, focus on that first sentence, delete the second sentence, So Northern Virginia will plan for and invest in a sustainable and integrated multimodal transportation system that enhances quality of life, strengthens the economy, builds resilience. And those last three components become the basis for the transaction goals if this vision statement were to be adopted. So Sri, if you could go to the next slide. So again, the proposed vision is in the dark blue bar at the top. On the left-hand side, we have placeholders for a mobility, an accessibility, and a resiliency goal. And then in the objectives and measures column, just as an illustration, not anything we want any decision on, even this calendar year. This is probably something that we'll need to wait for at least another year, because we need to get the public engagement activity going and process that before we can come to you with detailed proposals on objectives and measures. But so really here we're just kind of illustrating how it might work should this vision and these three goals come to pass. And one of the things we've tried to do here is reduce the number of measures from 15 to maybe half that number, because the problem when you get when you have 15 measures is it seems as though everything is your priority, but in reality, it's hard to discern what is your priority with so many measures. And so by reducing the number of measures, we feel that will enable us to have a bit more focus. Next slide, please, Sri. So this just kind of provides a little bit more detail on what the objectives and measures might be. I would say all the measures that are listed in the measures column and in the final column entitled include, drop, move or swap question mark. In total, the current 15 measures are all there. So we can track what happens to them. But this is what the basis of what we're trying to build here. And I would say that the major departure really from the current vision and goals is in that third goal, which looks to kind of thoughts of resilience of the transportation network. This is kind of becoming an emerging topic within transportation planning and transportation in general, and obviously speaks in part to how climate change might affect transportation choices in the future. And so this kind of is our first attempt to kind of pick up the environmental aspects that were in the previous version of transaction, but to make them a little bit more focused on resiliency of the transportation system moving forward. I've got one more slide, I believe. If you could advance, Sri. So, the final slide here is a topic that I've called core values. To my knowledge, the authority has not explicitly built equity into the performance measures or indeed the vision or the goals or the objectives. It's a topic, obviously, which is very relevant today, and so we wanted to take an opportunity to see what other transportation planning organizations around the nation are doing with respect to equity in transportation, and then figure out how we can address that within our own long-range plan. So equity may not be the only core value which we're referring to, but when I say core value, what I really mean is rather than specifically having an equity goal, objectives or measures, that the approach we might want to take instead is to kind of look holistically across the entire transaction plan and kind of look at an equity overlay as a core value, and then kind of in some way determine whether the projects that are in transaction and the approach to evaluating them is really embracing equity. I don't have any more specifics on that because we really are at the very early stage of doing this. And I don't think any decision we ask you to make later this year on vision and goals will necessarily preclude the inclusion of equity as either a measure or, as I say, under this umbrella of core values. If there are other core values we might want to approach in the same way, one candidate might be safety. The authority, found in legislation refers to safety, but safety in a long-range plan is something which we can't necessarily foresee the safety issues in 2040 or 2045. And so having safety as a core value as opposed to a specific measure might be an option we should consider. But again, that would not necessarily have any bearing on your final decision on vision and goals. So with that, this is just an information item. Happy to take any initial feedback, but we will kind of bring this back to you in subsequent months with a little bit more flesh on the bone and a more specific action that we'd like to hear from this committee. And this committee will probably be the final filter on what goes to the authority. So you will have the benefit of hearing what the Technical Advisory Committee and the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee, as well as Staff Committee, kind of has to say on this topic before deciding how you want to address this with the authority. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. And obviously, since it's the first time everyone's had the opportunity to see this, you'll get this out to everyone along with the other slides, and that way everyone can be prepared to have kind of a more fulsome conversation on the details of this and offer some specific feedback. Okay, any kind of overarching questions for Mr. Jasper at this point, knowing that this is the first time we've seen this? So, all right. Let's see. Anything, Ms. Hines? Is that you're waving your hand, or sorry?
I'm debating just for a minute about going back about the word equity, and just thinking that it might be useful to build out a little bit more what you mean by equity. What's in the federal law? I mean, we all know we have to do this equity analysis when we change routes and stuff, and that's sort of a baseline. But I may know that from a transit perspective. I may not know how that fits into anything related to roads or other kinds of things. I know TPB has identified equity areas that potentially need to have more attention paid to them in terms of creating access. I guess what I'm saying is, what I know is kind of scattered and not, I don't have a systematic way to think about this relative to transportation. And so I think if we're going to have a decent conversation about it, we probably need to put a little bit more meat on the bones. And I would also say that I certainly hope it's our vision that we are going to provide we are going to plan for and provide this in an equitable manner. So I would almost argue that the notion of serving people equitably in our region has to be built in at the very front end in that statement. Enhances quality of life is a little fuzzy, is fuzzier than the other two in that statement. So those are reactions off the top of my head. But I have been thinking about equity a lot in transportation, and realizing how weak my ability to talk about it is. So it seems like you guys could help us with that.
Yeah, no, I think those are great comments. Thanks, Ms. Hines, for that. I know that, Alexander, we just went through our what we called our transit vision study, which was basically looking at our whole dash route system and revisioning it based on kind of where things are today, and equity was a key component of that, and it definitely challenged. I have to say it challenged some of the community discussions and the community input we received, because when you applied an equity lens on some of the changes we were considering, it very much surprised people and ran in some cases counter to the kind of popular community input that was being received. So it's definitely a conversation that needs to be central to these decisions. So, okay, other comments, Councilmember Snyder.
Just a quick two. First of all, I think the safety issue shouldn't be deprioritized in any way. I'm not saying necessarily whether it includes as a goal or whether it's one of the 3 or 4 major things. But if we're not moving people safely, we're really failing. And as we know from the data, nationwide and our region isn't doing a great job in that area. So that would be number 1. Number 2, the issue of technology and how we integrate it more effectively into everything we do. And the third comment would be to just support the mention and the discussion of equity. I'm really interested as to what it really means and how you apply it. And I think we can learn a lot from the jurisdictions here and elsewhere that have actually achieved success in that area. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Schneider. Any additional comments, questions? Okay.
Hey, Mayor Wilson, this is Delegate Rome. I'm so sorry for getting on the call a little bit late. The House floor session went past 5, and then I had my town hall on evictions that just ended. So sorry, I'm just starting to yell now.
No problem. We appreciate you joining us right at the end. So thank you for being with us, Delegate Rome. Any other comments, questions? All right, our next meeting is to be determined. Is that right? Okay, so we will be back in touch on scheduling of our next meeting. Have a good I don't know what season we call this anymore, what month it is at this point. Whatever it is, have a good one, and we will see you back next time. So thanks everyone, appreciate it. Thank you. Stay safe.
They will.